Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, let's take a journey together into the heart of a medieval winter. I want you to picture this with me, not in the way of closing your eyes and pretending, but through the raw facts, the hard evidence, and the lived reality of our ancestors. Because the truth is, when we ask, where did medieval peasants sleep during freezing winter nights? The answers are not soft or cozy. They are gritty, smoky, crowded, and surprisingly ingenious. And they tell us something about human resilience that still matters today. Let's start with the basics. Most peasants in medieval Europe lived in one-room cottages, sometimes called longhouses. These weren't the fairy tale cottages you see on postcards. They were rough structures, mud walls, timber frames, thatched roofs that leaked, and floors of packed dirt or straw. And when winter swept across northern Europe, with snow piling high and temperatures plunging below freezing, that single room had to hold not only the family but often their animals, their tools, and their survival itself. You might be asking, why animals inside the house? The answer is simple: warmth. Cows, goats, pigs, they were more than food sources. They were living heaters. A pig pressed against your legs could mean the difference between frostbite and just another miserable but survivable night. Imagine lying down with your children, your spouse, your aging parents, and yes, a goat or two, all breathing the same smoky air, all fighting the same cold. It wasn't glamorous, but it was necessary. Now, when we talk about sleep, don't imagine anything close to a bed as you know it. Forget mattresses, pillows, or pajamas. The bed for most peasants was a pile of straw on the floor, sometimes stuffed into a sack if you were lucky. That straw wasn't fresh. Either it was reused, damp, full of insects, and smelled strongly of animals and smoke. Blankets? If you had one, it was patched wool or linen, often just a single cover stretched over the entire family. So how did people survive under such conditions? That's where things get fascinating. Survival wasn't about finding perfect comfort. It was about stacking small defenses against the cold. Fire was the obvious one, but wood was scarce and precious. In some villages, stealing firewood from the Lord's forest was punishable by fines or worse. So families learned to sleep with the fire. They banked embers under ashes at night, keeping them alive until dawn. Too much fuel and you wasted resources. Too little and you woke to a frozen hearth and stiff limbs. But fire was never enough. Drafts crept in from every crack. And here's a detail that surprises many. Most peasants never saw a glass window in their lives. At best, wealthier households used oiled parchment or thin slices of animal horn to let in light. But the majority? Just holes cut in the wall, blocked at night with rags, straw, or even fish bladders stretched and dried to act as makeshift panes. Does that sound disgusting? Maybe, but it was resourceful. And it worked well. Sort of. Families still felt the icy fingers of the wind pushing through. And that's why sleeping positions mattered. It wasn't just about comfort, it was about strategy. Children were usually placed in the middle, shielded by parents and grandparents on the edges. Elders often took the brunt of drafts, while the youngest were cocooned for survival. Think of it like a living human shield against the cold. Some households even developed spoon-like sleeping chains, rolling in unison through the night to share warmth. It sounds chaotic, and it was. But it was also rhythm an unspoken choreography of survival. Now, let's pause and think. How would you react if every night your bed was alive with scratching? Because medieval peasants didn't just sleep with family and animals, they slept with fleas, lice, and bedbugs. Archaeologists have literally found fossilized flea remains in layers of medieval straw bedding. Remedies existed, of course, herbs like wormwood and lavender burned in the hearth to repel pests, ashes scattered in straw, even prayers and charms against night demons. But the truth? People scratched, cursed, and carried on. It wasn't about winning the fight against bugs. It was about enduring them. And speaking of charms, faith was woven into sleep as much as straw and wool. Bedtime prayers were common. Parents traced the sign of the cross on children's foreheads, whispered psalms, or sprinkled holy water on bedding. Was it superstition? Maybe. But in a world where wolves prowled outside, thieves tested weak doors, and sickness spread like wildfire, belief gave families one more layer of defense. Fear was constant, and faith turned that fear into something they could face. But let's not imagine every night was endless misery. There were softer moments too. Winter festivals like Christmas or Epiphany broke the monotony with song, fire, and feasting. On those rare nights, peasants might go to bed full of spiced ale or sweet cakes, their children lulled by laughter instead of coughs. And even on ordinary nights, storytelling filled the dark. Fairy tales, riddles, songs, they weren't luxuries. They were survival tools. Because when you're huddled in a smoky hut with fleas biting and drafts cutting through rags, a funny story or a lullaby isn't entertainment, it's medicine. Now let's contrast this with the nobility. Nobles slept on carved oak bedsteads, with feather mattresses, fur-lined covers, and embroidered curtains. They had warming pans filled with embers to preheat sheets. Even comfort dogs, bred to sleep at their feet. Sounds luxurious, right? Yet even they complained of drafts, frost forming on curtains, and noses frozen under silk sheets. The stone walls of castles trapped cold like a cellar. Which tells us something important. Winter was the great equalizer. Whether you were a peasant scratching fleas in straw or a noble grumbling under velvet, the cold was always there. And monks? Their nights were harsher still, guided by rules of discipline. Some slept fully clothed on hard pallets, even sitting upright to avoid sloth. They rose at midnight for vigils, praying in frozen chapels where ink froze in inkwells. Compared to them, peasants almost had it easy. At least peasants could joke, sing, or curl against a pig for warmth. Monks embraced discomfort as devotion, turning cold into spiritual training. So where did medieval peasants sleep? The short answer is, anywhere that kept them alive. On straw, in smoky huts, pressed against family and animals, under patchwork cloths, behind prayers and laughter. They didn't conquer the cold. They endured it, one cough, one ember, one story at a time. And here's the real takeaway. Comfort is relative. We think of central heating, memory foam mattresses, and cozy pajamas as normal. But for most of human history, survival meant accepting discomfort and finding strength in community. Maybe that's why so many fairy tales and folk songs were born in huts like these. When the body couldn't escape hardship, the mind created warmth. So tonight, as you tuck yourself into your own bed, maybe spare a thought for the peasants who came before us. They didn't ask for perfect sleep. They asked for one thing: to wake again at dawn. And against all odds, many did. That in itself was victory. When we think of sleep, we often imagine stillness, a quiet retreat from the noise of the day. But for medieval peasants, stillness was a luxury they rarely had. Nights were crowded, restless, and alive with motion. Imagine a family of 6 or 7 squeezed onto a single layer of straw, pressed shoulder to shoulder, with a goat shifting near your feet and a pig grunting softly at your side. Sleep wasn't private. It was communal, messy, and constantly interrupted. One of the most striking things historians note is how peasants arranged themselves at night. There was strategy to it. Children in the middle, where warmth was thickest. Grandparents often took the outer edges, their bodies shielding the young from drafts that crept in through cracks in the walls. Sometimes families even formed spoon-like chains, each back pressed to the next, so heat passed along the line. One person rolled over, and like dominoes, the whole chain shifted with them. It wasn't graceful, it was survival. And yet, not every family followed the same pattern. Archaeologists studying soot marks and impressions in cottage floors have suggested other shapes: circles with feet pointed toward the fire, or head-to-foot arrangements to prevent anyone's chest from being left bare to the chill. To modern ears, this might sound uncomfortable, but in the deep cold of January, comfort was irrelevant. Warmth was the only currency that mattered. Of course, these close quarters came with costs. Privacy didn't exist. Imagine every sneeze, every cough, every snore echoing in your ear. If one child had a fever, everyone inhaled it. If one person tossed restlessly, the entire bed shifted. Did peasants sleep deeply? Some scholars argue they adapted, their bodies learning to rest even in chaos. Others believe chronic sleep deprivation was simply part of life, explaining constant fatigue recorded in labor contracts and manorial accounts. The truth is likely somewhere in between. And then there was the problem of vermin. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs were not visitors. They were permanent roommates. Fossilized remains of these pests have been found in medieval bedding, proof that no amount of shaking or brushing ever truly banished them. Families fought back with what they had. Bundles of wormwood burned in the hearth to drive out insects, ashes scattered in straw, even pungent herbs stuffed into bedding. Did it work? Maybe a little. But most of the time, people simply scratched, sighed, and went back to sleep. Can you imagine lying awake at night, not from noise, but from the constant itching of tiny bites? Some folklore even reimagined fleas as God's reminder of humility, a way to keep peasants from pride. Whether that brought comfort or not is hard to say. What we do know is that people endured it, night after night, year after year. And yet, sleep was never just a physical act. It carried layers of meaning, spiritual, cultural, and even medical. Medieval people believed strongly in the idea of 2 sleeps. After dusk, they settled into what they called the first sleep. Sometime around midnight, they woke again tending the fire, checking on animals, whispering prayers, sometimes even sharing stories or intimacy, before drifting into a second sleep that lasted until dawn. This rhythm was not strange to them. It was natural, shaped by the long nights of winter and the short days of labor. Imagine the hut at that hour between sleeps. The fire crackles faintly, embers glowing red. Parents murmur prayers, their words drifting into the smoky dark. Children stir, half awake, asking questions about angels or spring. Someone rises to tend the fire, carefully adding twigs, guarding the precious heat. Outside, snow presses against the door. Inside, life continues, not fully awake, not fully asleep, but balanced in that strange middle rhythm of medieval nights. Food also shaped sleep. Weak ale was often drunk before bed, not the kind to make you drunk, but a low-alcohol brew safer than water and filled with calories. Some families even gave it to children. It dulled hunger, warmed the belly, and made it easier to drift off despite the cold. Chroniclers joked that a man who went to bed without ale dreamed of wolves. Whether superstition or simple observation, the truth is that ale, even more than blankets, often carried families through the night. But hunger had the opposite effect. Dreams of bread, fields of wheat, or warm kitchens filled the minds of peasants who went to bed on empty stomachs. Many medieval sermons and household manuals mention dreams, often framing them as divine messages. Yet hunger and cold were just as likely culprits. Nightmares of suffocation, known as the mare that pressed down on chests, probably stemmed from the crush of sleeping bodies, or the heavy weight of animals pressing too close. And so, superstition grew from lived reality, fear wrapped around physical sensations. Faith remained a constant companion in the night. Families prayed before bed, asking for protection against both earthly dangers and unseen ones. Charms were common. Iron scissors placed on windowsills to cut off spirits, salt sprinkled near doors to block witches, holy water splashed onto straw to ward off illness. To us, these may sound like quaint rituals. To them, they were practical tools, as necessary as patching a blanket or banking the fire. And threats were real. Theft was a constant fear in winter, when hunger drove people to desperate acts. A single pig or sack of grain could mean survival for one family and ruin for another. So parents slept lightly, ears tuned to knocks at the door or footsteps outside. Some villagers even placed brooms across thresholds, believing thieves would be forced to count every straw before entering. Was it magical thinking or clever psychology? Maybe both. Yet despite fear, there was also community. Strangers were often welcomed into cottages on freezing nights, not out of generosity alone, but necessity. To turn someone away could mean their death, and worse, it could mean God himself had been refused, since folklore taught that Christ might appear disguised as a beggar. More bodies also meant more warmth, so sometimes suspicion yielded to survival. Families learned to trust cautiously, tucking possessions close, but lifting blankets nonetheless. And what about children? They were always the priority. The youngest tucked in first, wrapped in whatever cloth or straw was available, while parents stayed awake longer to tend the fire. Adolescents often had duties during the night, stirring embers, fetching water, watching animals. Childhood ended quickly in the medieval world, and even in bed, responsibility pressed early. Parents, however burdened, still shielded the young. Records even show mothers fined if infants froze, a harsh reminder of how fragile life was. Illness, too, haunted the night. Winter air thick with smoke, damp rafters dripping condensation, and bodies pressed together created perfect conditions for pneumonia, fevers, and bronchitis. Remedies were makeshift onions warmed in ashes and pressed to the chest, honey mixed with vinegar for sore throats. Faith filled the gaps, with prayers to street blaze for protection against throat ailments. But no matter the remedy, the fear lingered with every cough echoing through the dark. And yet, even in sickness, people found ways to soften the night. Storytelling, songs, riddles. These weren't extras, they were survival strategies. Folklorists believe many fairy tales were born in smoky huts like these, whispered while children drifted towards sleep. Tales of clever foxes, riddles about rivers and mouths that cannot speak, songs hummed by mothers with cracked voices, all were forms of warmth. A lord once scolded peasants for singing late into the night, despite their poverty. Their reply? "If we cannot laugh, we will die faster." That single line tells us more than any chronicle. Laughter, like fire, kept them alive. So where did medieval peasants sleep during freezing winter nights? The answer grows richer the more we look. They slept in straw, yes, but also in stories. They slept in smoke, but also in song. They endured fleas, drafts, and fear, but they also endured with faith, humor, and community. Sleep wasn't rest, it was resilience. And every dawn they woke was proof that, for one more day, they had won the battle against winter. Let's pick up where we left off. By now, we've seen how medieval peasants piled together for warmth, fought fleas and drafts, whispered prayers, and trusted strangers because survival left no other option. But let's step deeper into the night, because medieval sleep wasn't only about warmth, it was about order, fear, resilience, and even identity. Think about how a family bed was structured. It wasn't random chaos, though exhaustion often made it look that way. There were rules, spoken or unspoken. Children in the middle, elders on the outside. Parents anchoring the formation, shifting when needed. Sometimes entire families turned in rhythm. One person rolled, the others followed like waves. Imagine the sound of straw crunching, elbows bumping, sighs echoing in the dark. That choreography of survival might feel suffocating to us, but it was second nature to them. And it wasn't unique to peasants. Monks, too, had their formations. In monasteries, long dormitories stretched across cold stone halls. Each monk lay on his own narrow pallet, sometimes separated by partitions, sometimes not. Fire was rare, blankets thin, comfort discouraged. To them, the chill was discipline, a test of faith. Some even slept sitting upright, belts still strapped, so they could leap awake at the midnight bell. Can you picture that? A line of weary men, nodding off in wooden chairs, convinced that comfort was the enemy of holiness. Then there were the nobles. Grand chambers hung with tapestries, feather beds layered with silks and furs, servants tending fires and sliding bed-warming pans under covers. But even there, frost crept through cracks, and drafts sneaked past shutters. One French noblewoman wrote that she woke to find frost on the inside of her curtains. So much for luxury. Comfort was relative. A peasant might curse fleas in straw, while a lord cursed the icy tip of his nose under velvet sheets. But wherever you looked, hut, monastery, or castle, nobody truly slept alone. Privacy, as we imagine, it didn't exist. Darkness encouraged clustering. Families, servants, monks, even travelers shared the same space. Records show strangers were often welcomed into huts, and nobles sometimes had entire households sleeping in their chambers. Imagine the smells, the noise, the intimacy. Every breath was public. Every cough belonged to the room. Sleep wasn't just physical, it was communal, a negotiation of space, warmth, and survival. And then there was sound. Medieval villages were far from silent. Dogs barked at shadows, roosters crowed at all hours, drunken songs carried through thatched walls. Court records even mention complaints about noisy neighbors singing after dark. The phrase, "the walls have ears and the roof has a tongue," captured that truth. Nothing stayed private. To live in a village was to be surrounded by constant sound, even in the dead of night. For peasants, the thin walls of a hut meant every argument, every laugh, every cough bled into the collective rhythm of the community. Of course, danger came with those sounds too. Knocks at the door were not always friendly. Theft was common, especially in the dead of winter. A stolen pig could mean hunger. A missing sack of grain could tip a family into famine. Parents kept staffs by the fire, ears sharp for footsteps outside. Some even placed charms or brooms across thresholds, hoping to confuse both thieves and spirits. It might sound superstitious, but when your entire livelihood could vanish with one knock, you guarded it however you could. And still, people found ways to laugh. Humor was one of their greatest defenses. Folklore is filled with jokes about sleeping arrangements. Husbands grumbling about losing the warm middle to their wives, or proverbs warning that he who sleeps at the edge wakes with frost. Even in misery, peasants made light of their struggles, because sometimes laughter was as necessary as blankets. One chronicle even records a lord scolding peasants for singing late into the night despite their poverty. Their reply? "If we cannot laugh, we will die faster." That one line reveals everything about resilience. Festivals, too, changed the rhythm of sleep. At Christmas or Epiphany, bonfires lit village squares, carols echoed through lanes, and peasants feasted on rare roasted meat. Even the poorest families tasted spiced ale, passing bowls hand to hand, sharing warmth that wasn't just physical. Nights like these were brief, but they mattered. They reminded people that winter was not endless, that joy could pierce the dark. Imagine children falling asleep after dancing by firelight, their cheeks flushed, their bellies full. For one night, straw beds felt softer, laughter lingered in the air, and despair retreated. Dreams also shaped the medieval night. With hunger and cold pressing constantly, dreams of food, warmth, or fear were common. Folklore warned of demons called the mare, pressing down on sleepers' chests, suffocating them. Today we'd call it sleep paralysis. Back then, it was proof that the night was never empty, that spirits lurked in the dark. Families placed knives under beds, pointed outward, or whispered charms to street Michael to ward off nightmares. Superstition was not just fear, it was a way of naming the unknown, turning terror into ritual, chaos into something manageable. And illness was the silent guest at every medieval bedside. In smoky, damp huts, coughs spread like wildfire. Pneumonia, bronchitis, fevers. They didn't have those names, but they had the symptoms, and they feared them. Remedies were makeshift. Onions warmed in ashes, honey mixed with vinegar, prayers whispered to saints. Sometimes they worked, often they didn't. Winter mortality soared, especially for children and elders. And yet every morning, a child's breath still rising was a victory. Survival itself became the measure of success. So how did medieval peasants sleep during freezing winter nights? Not easily, not peacefully, but with remarkable resilience. They layered defenses, blankets, animals, prayers, songs. They endured fleas, drafts, hunger, and fear. They welcomed strangers, trusted charms, and laughed when laughter seemed impossible. Sleep was not an escape from struggle. It was part of the struggle. And every dawn proved their stubbornness had carried them through. We've been talking about smoky huts, flea-bitten straw, and the endless shuffle of bodies pressed together for warmth. But here's the thing. Peasants didn't always sleep exactly the same way every single night. Winter forced people to adapt, to get creative, and sometimes to improvise in ways that might surprise you. So let's pull back the curtain and look at where else medieval peasants might have laid their heads when frost and hunger pressed hardest. For most families, the central sleeping space was the main room of the cottage, where the fire burned. But not every peasant even had a separate room. In poorer homes, one smoky chamber served every purpose: cooking, eating, working, and sleeping. By day, benches and stools. By night, straw and bodies. Privacy? Forget it. Everyone, from babies to grandparents, shared that same ground. It sounds unbearable to us now, but back then, it was simply life. And yet, not every peasant ended up in their own cottage at night. Records from Flanders tell us some families abandoned their homes in the deepest cold and moved directly into barns with their livestock. Think about it. A thatched roof, mud walls, and a drafty door didn't always hold heat, but cows, sheep, and goats, living, breathing heaters. Archaeologists have even found soot patterns and animal bones, suggesting people and beasts really did share space in winter. To modern ears, it might sound disgusting, but imagine the relief of curling up beside a cow, its body radiating warmth while snow piled against the walls. And animals weren't just warmth, they were alarm systems. A barking dog or restless goat might warn a family of wolves or thieves in the night. Sleep was never just sleep, it was survival strategy. Every snort, grunt, or shuffle meant safety as much as discomfort. Now let's talk about beds. We've pictured straw heaps on the floor, but even there, differences existed. Some peasants managed wooden bed frames, simple structures with ropes stretched across. The ropes sagged with weight, so people tightened them regularly. Ever heard the phrase "sleep tight"? That comes straight from this practice. In winter, those ropes were covered with sacks stuffed full of straw, rushes, or even leaves. Not luxurious, but at least it lifted sleepers off the damp ground. But here's the problem. Straw rots. It gets damp, attracts pests, and loses fluff quickly. Medieval guides recommended replacing it often, but for peasants, often meant maybe twice a year, if that. So winter nights meant lying in musty bedding full of fleas, lice, and mites. Families tried tricks, burning wormwood or scattering ashes to drive pests away, but it was never perfect. You can imagine the endless scratching, sighing, and resigned laughter echoing in the dark. Still, there were little comforts. Some families hung cloth canopies from ropes strung across the room, creating makeshift tents. Even a patched sheet could block drafts and create a bubble of warmth. One story tells of a man bragging that his wife stitched a canopy from old tunics and made their hut as warm as a noble's chamber. Probably an exaggeration, but you get the point. Ingenuity mattered. And let's not forget superstition. Medieval peasants didn't see the night as empty. To them, it was full of spirits, demons, and dangers. Some placed scissors on windowsills, believing the iron cut evil before it entered. Others scattered salt at doorways to stop witches. Children were told not to point at the moon, or demons would follow their fingers inside. Whether you believe these tales literally or not, they shaped how people felt in the dark. Sleep wasn't just a fight against cold, it was also a fight against fear. Compare this to monasteries. Monks also slept in the cold, but for different reasons. They chose austerity, thin blankets, stone floors, little heat. They believed comfort tempted sin. Some even slept with shoes on, ready to rise at the midnight bell for prayer. Can you imagine drifting off with boots still strapped to your feet? Meanwhile, nobles lived in stone halls, where even silk and velvet couldn't chase frost from the walls. They had feather beds and warming pans, yes, but they too complained of cold noses and icy curtains. In that sense, winter was the great equalizer. Rich or poor, nobody escaped it. And then there were travelers. Roads were rough, inns expensive, so strangers often knocked at cottage doors seeking shelter. Hospitality wasn't optional. To refuse risked shame, even divine punishment. One German folktale warned that Christ himself might arrive in disguise as a weary traveler. So peasants opened their doors, even when suspicious. A guest might be a blessing or a thief. Either way, more bodies meant more heat. That gamble of trust was as much part of medieval sleep as straw or fire. But what about children? They were always the most vulnerable. Families tucked them in first, wrapped in tunics and cloaks, cocooned in the warmest spots. Parents bore the cold at the edges so little ones might survive. There's even evidence of laws fining mothers if infants froze in the night, a grim reminder of how fragile survival was. Some folk songs promised angels watched over children if they lay still. Probably more lullaby than theology, but effective nonetheless. Illness, of course, was the ever-present threat. Coughs spread quickly in damp huts. Remedies ranged from onion poultices to honey vinegar syrups, or simply prayers to saints like Street Blaze, protector of throats. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Mortality soared in January and February, especially for the very young and very old. And yet, families rose each morning, patching clothes, stoking fires, hoping today would be one of the lucky days. Festivals punctuated the misery. On Christmas or Epiphany, fires blazed in village squares, carols rang out, and peasants feasted on rare treats. For one night, they laughed, danced, and drank spiced ale. Even if tomorrow hunger returned, tonight joy kept them alive. Imagine drifting to sleep after such a night. Belly full, heart lighter, straw suddenly softer. So where did medieval peasants sleep during freezing winter nights? In smoky huts, in barns with animals, under patched canopies, on straw sacks that scratched and itched, beside strangers, children, and livestock. They slept in fear and in laughter, in prayer and in song. They survived not by chasing comfort, but by layering small defenses. A goat's warmth, a charm at the door, a shared tale, a whispered psalm. No single tactic saved them. Together, they made endurance possible. We've walked through smoky huts and frosty barns, but here's something that often gets overlooked. Peasants didn't sleep the same way in summer as they did in winter. The rhythms of the medieval year shaped everything from meals to marriages, and sleep was no exception. To understand how people endured those brutal nights in January, You have to see how their sleeping lives shifted across the seasons. Think about harvest time. In August or September, fields didn't just demand daylight. Work often stretched until the last trace of twilight, and people collapsed right there in barns or even in the fields themselves. There are accounts from England and France describing workers nodding off in haystacks, exhausted after hauling grain all day. Imagine the sweet smell of cut grass, the scratch of straw against your neck, and the sky above filled with stars instead of smoke. Was it comfortable? Probably not. But compared to the damp huts of January, a summer night outside could feel like luxury. Seasonal sleep also meant seasonal chores. In winter, families clustered indoors, huddling against drafts. But in warmer months, many actually preferred to step outside. Archaeologists have found evidence of outdoor platforms, simple raised boards used for sleeping when cottages were too hot or smoky. In Mediterranean regions, peasants sometimes slept on rooftops under the open sky, chasing breezes. In Northern Europe, summer nights were short anyway. Sleep became segmented not by cold, but by the demands of work. You might rest a few hours, rise to tend animals, nap at midday, and keep going until late harvest feasts. And here's where it gets fascinating. The medieval body clock wasn't locked into our modern 8 hours straight. Just like in winter, with first and second sleep, summer carried its own rhythms. Some households embraced polyphasic rest, napping at odd intervals, catching whatever sleep they could between labor. To us, it might sound chaotic. To them, it was natural. The idea of one fixed bedtime didn't exist. Sleep was flexible, shifting with daylight and duties. Let's circle back to winter. Why does this seasonal contrast matter? Because peasants knew what they were missing. They remembered nights when a haystack felt soft, when air carried the scent of apples and not smoke. Winter's misery was sharper, because summer had offered glimpses of ease. Folklore even tied dreams to seasons. A vision of green meadows in December was seen as a blessing, proof spring would return. Now consider feasts. Medieval Europe ran on the church calendar, which punctuated long winters with moments of joy. Christmas, Epiphany, Candlemas. These weren't just holy days, they were chances to break routine. Fires burned brighter, ale flowed thicker, and peasants sometimes stayed awake all night, caroling or telling stories. Sleep gave way to celebration. And in those rare nights, the cold was forgotten. Chroniclers noted how even the poorest drank from the wassail bowl, ale spiced with apples and cloves, passing warmth hand to hand. But hardship crept back fast. Once festivals ended, huts returned to silence, fleas, and smoke. And that's where resilience came in. People layered small comforts, not just physically, but emotionally. Songs, riddles, and fairy tales filled smoky nights. Many of the stories we know today about foxes, wolves, clever peasants, and mischievous saints were shaped in those very hours before sleep. Imagine a grandfather's cracked voice spinning a tale while children drifted off, fleas forgotten for a moment. That, too, was survival. Children's place in this cycle mattered deeply. Parents shielded them in the warmest spots during winter. But in summer, kids sometimes fell asleep in corners of barns or even out in fields. Sleep mirrored responsibility. Little ones were wrapped early, older children kept watch or fetched water before lying down. Adolescence wasn't a pause, it was a transition into duty, visible even in bedtime rituals. And what about fear? Night always carried danger, but its form shifted with the season. In winter, it was frost, sickness, and hunger. In summer, it was fire, raids, or theft during long festival nights. Villagers told stories of thieves slipping into houses while families dozed in fields or barns. Protection was never absolute. Sleep meant risk, and people balanced it constantly between warmth and vulnerability, between rest and vigilance. One quirky superstition said that laughter at the cold could make it sting less. Another claimed garlic before bed brought bad dreams. Whether these were jokes or genuine beliefs, they reveal something crucial. Peasants turned even sleep into a field of meaning. It wasn't just biology. It was cultural, spiritual, communal, and here's the big takeaway. Where did medieval peasants sleep during freezing winter nights? Not in one fixed place, not in guaranteed comfort. They slept where they could on straw, under patched cloth, beside goats, even in barns. But those winter nights were part of a larger rhythm. Summer brought haystacks and rooftop. Autumn meant barns heavy with grain. Spring meant damp but hopeful huts. Each season carried its own sleep, its own compromises. So when you imagine a peasant winter night, picture it as one chapter in a year-long cycle. Not endless misery, but part of a rhythm that included warmth, stories, festivals, and even laughter. That's what made survival possible. Not just endurance, but adaptation, shifting sleep with every season, every feast, every hardship. When we talk about medieval sleep, it's easy to imagine one picture: a smoky hut filled with peasants shivering through the night. And yes, for the majority of people, that was reality. But the Middle Ages was not one single class or one single experience. Sleep itself looked very different, depending on who you were: a farmer in a village, a monk in a monastery, or a noble in a stone castle. And comparing these worlds tells us something important. Comfort was relative, and even privilege couldn't fully escape winter's grip. Let's start with the peasants, because they made up the bulk of the population. Their beds were rarely beds at all. More often they were sacks stuffed with straw, sometimes refreshed with ash to keep pests away. Archaeologists have found layers of charred straw in excavated huts, evidence that bedding was burned or replaced when infestations got too bad. Privacy didn't exist. Families and animals shared the same space, pressed together for warmth. A goat by your feet, a pig grunting in the straw. This was the medieval version of central heating. Was it dignified? Hardly. Was it effective? Absolutely. Without the animals, many would not have survived the coldest months. Now let's shift to the monastery. Here, the story changes, but not necessarily for the better. Monks lived by rules, and one of those rules shaped how they slept. The rule of St. Benedict, written in the 6th century but followed for centuries after, prescribed communal dormitories. Imagine rows of narrow pallets laid out on cold stone, each monk in his own space, but with little more than a thin blanket or coarse wool sheet. Fires were rare. Comfort was seen as temptation, even sin. In some orders, monks slept fully clothed, belts still fastened, so they could rise instantly for midnight prayers. Some sources even claim certain novices were made to sleep sitting upright, to fight laziness. Compared to peasants, monks at least had structure, individual pallets, instead of tangled straw heaps. But that structure came at a cost. The stone walls of monasteries were notorious for radiating cold. Chroniclers describe ink freezing in scriptoriums, frost forming on blankets, monks waking with chilblains and stiff lungs. Discipline was supposed to harden the body and soul. In practice, it often broke them down. Yet, monks believed this suffering brought them closer to God. For peasants, discomfort was endured because they had no choice. For monks, it was embraced as a path to holiness. And then, at the top of the social pyramid, you had nobles. Surely, they must have slept in comfort? To some degree, yes. Surviving inventories, list beds carved from oak, mattresses filled with feathers or wool, blankets lined with fur. Nobles slept under embroidered hangings, sometimes behind heavy curtains that could trap warmth. Servants preheated sheets with bed-warming pans filled with embers. Compared to a peasant's itchy tunic and straw sack, it sounds like luxury. But here's the catch. Castles were made of stone, massive, drafty, and nearly impossible to heat. Fires roared in great halls, but bedchambers were often icy, with frost forming inside the very curtains meant to keep warmth in. One French noblewoman complained in the 14th century that she woke to find her breath frozen on the silk above her bed. Imagine that, surrounded by velvet, yet still shivering. Wealth could buy layers of fabric, but not immunity from winter's bite. And luxury brought its own problems. Feather beds were softer than straw, yes, but they also attracted pests. Fleas and lice didn't care about embroidery. In fact, warm furs and feather mattresses often made infestations worse. Remedies for bedbugs appear not just in peasant guides but in noble household manuals, proof that wealth did not keep vermin away. Comfort and misery lived side by side. So which class slept best? Scholars still argue. Some insist nobles had a real advantage. Their feather beds and bed curtains created pockets of genuine warmth. Others counter that stone walls made them just as cold, and that peasants, huddled with family and animals, may have been warmer in practice. Monks, of course, denied themselves comfort deliberately, so their sleep was probably the harshest of all. But here's the deeper truth. No matter the class, sleep was never secure. Peasants feared thieves or wolves at the door. Nobles feared raiders breaching walls. Monks feared sin creeping into their discipline. Every rank had its own form of unrest. The cold was a great equalizer, but so was fear. One detail really drives this home. In wills, nobles often listed their bedsteads as prized heirlooms, carved posts, embroidered curtains, feather mattresses. Peasants almost never mentioned their bedding at all. Straw was too temporary, too ordinary. It was life, not wealth. That contrast shows how sleep itself became a marker of status. For nobles, a bed displayed power. For peasants, a bed simply meant survival. And yet, across every level, the human needs were the same: to shut eyes against the dark, to trust that dawn would come, to find warmth where they could in animals, in furs, in faith. Rich or poor, monk or farmer, everyone lived within the same long winter nights, wrestling with the same wind, the same drafts, the same doubts. When you picture a medieval night, you might think of straw, smoke, and shivering bodies. But for people of that era, night was never just physical. It was spiritual. The dark carried more than cold. It carried meaning, fear, and faith. Sleep itself became a battleground, not only against drafts and fleas, but against invisible forces that peasants believed hovered just beyond the door. Religion and superstition were woven into every aspect of medieval life, and bedtime was no exception. For many families, lying down at night was accompanied by prayer. Parents taught children short verses to recite before sleep, sometimes simplified into rhymes. A mother might trace the sign of the cross on each child's forehead, not as a ritual of comfort, but as a shield. The night was full of dangers, both real and imagined. Prayer was armor. Yet faith wasn't always orthodox. Alongside prayers to God or the Virgin Mary, peasants often clung to folk charms. One popular superstition warned against pointing at the moon after dark, lest spirits follow the gesture into the home. Others placed scissors or knives on windowsills, believing the sharp iron cut through demonic influence. A broom laid across the threshold supposedly confused intruding spirits or thieves, forcing them to count each straw before entering. Practical? Not exactly. But when you live in a drafty hut with nothing but a wooden bar on the door, sometimes faith is the only defense. Dreams, too, carried heavy weight. Medieval sermons often reminded people that visions in sleep could be divine messages or temptations from the devil. A dream of green fields in winter was seen as a blessing, a promise of spring. But a nightmare, especially the sensation of being pressed down and unable to breathe, was blamed on supernatural creatures like the mare, from which we get the word nightmare today. In German folklore, an Alp was believed to sit on a sleeper's chest, stealing their breath. In truth, it was likely sleep paralysis, or simply the weight of another body pressing too close. But to medieval peasants, it was a spirit to be feared. This blending of the sacred and the superstitious created a unique rhythm of the night. The line between faith and folklore blurred constantly. A family might pray the Lord's Prayer, then hang herbs like wormwood or tansy above the bed to ward off pests and spirits at the same time. They might sprinkle holy water on straw before sleeping, convinced it protected against both illness and demons. Was it science? Was it comfort? Absolutely. Historians still argue about how seriously peasants took these practices. Some say they were just stories, told lightly, a way to soothe children. Others insist they were deadly serious beliefs, strong enough to fuel accusations of witchcraft or even violent trials. The truth is probably somewhere in between. In the smoky dark of a hut, fear could be both real and imagined. A creak in the rafters might be just wind, or a sign of something darker. Belief gave people a way to explain the unexplainable. Monasteries had their own approach. While peasants used charms and prayers, monks fought fear with discipline. At midnight, they rose for vigils, chanting psalms in cold stone halls. The sound of voices echoing in unison was a way to claim the night for God, to push back against whatever evil they believed lurked outside. In villages, the same impulse existed, only less formal. Families murmured prayers in their huts, turning chaos into rhythm. And then there were festivals. During the harshest winters, nights were sometimes broken by Christmas, Epiphany, or local saints' days. Fires were lit, carols sung, and spiced ale shared. These nights blurred the line between celebration and ritual. A man might don animal skins, stomping through the streets to chase away evil spirits. A practice part theater, part spiritual defense. Children laughed, adults cheered. But beneath it all was the belief that joy itself could guard against winter's malice. The fascinating part is how universal these practices were, whether you were a peasant in a hut, a monk in a cloister, or even a noble in a castle, you went to bed with rituals. Nobles had embroidered bed curtains and chaplains to bless their chambers. Peasants had patched blankets and whispered charms. Both were ways of saying, "The night is long, but we will endure it." Modern people often think of sleep as biological 8 hours if you're lucky. But in the medieval world, it was social, spiritual, and symbolic. Every cough, every creak, every dream carried meaning. To wake at midnight wasn't just inconvenience. It was a moment to pray, to protect, to reaffirm faith. To whisper a charm wasn't superstition, it was survival. So when we ask where medieval peasants slept during freezing winter nights, we have to add another layer. They slept in huts, yes, but also under a canopy of belief. Blankets weren't just wool. They were faith stitched with fear, comfort patched with ritual. To them, a prayer was as vital as a cloak, a charm as essential as a fire. And whether those defenses worked physically didn't matter as much as whether they let people close their eyes at all. That is the secret modern minds often miss. Medieval sleep wasn't about conquering discomfort. It was about layering every possible shield cloth, animal warmth, herbs, prayers, even jokes, until the night felt survivable. And in that survival, in that fragile patchwork of faith and fear, the medieval world endured. If there's one thing we often underestimate about medieval life, it's how fragile health really was. In the modern world, a cough might mean a cold, maybe a doctor's visit. In the Middle Ages, a cough in the dead of winter could be a death sentence. And the place where danger struck hardest wasn't the fields or the market square, it was the bed. The very act of sleeping, huddled together in smoky huts, made sickness spread faster than any fire. Parish records from across Europe show spikes in mortality during the coldest months, January and February in particular. Infants and the elderly were the most vulnerable. A child with a wheeze, an old man with a rattle in his chest, these were not small matters. Families listened closely to each breath in the dark, praying that the sound wouldn't fade into silence. The living conditions made illness almost inevitable. Picture a hut crammed with 6 or 7 people, plus goats, pigs, maybe a cow in the corner. The air was already heavy with smoke from the hearth, which irritated lungs. Damp straw bedding grew moldy. Condensation dripped from the thatched roof onto blankets, keeping them damp. It was the perfect breeding ground for respiratory sickness. Pneumonia, bronchitis, influenza. They weren't called those names yet, but they were familiar killers. And yet, people did what they could. Remedies, both practical and hopeful, filled the medieval night. A warmed onion pressed to the chest was thought to draw illness out of a child's lungs. Honey mixed with vinegar soothed a raw throat. Garlic, boiled in milk, was prescribed for fevers. Did they work? Maybe a little. Honey truly does coat the throat. Garlic has mild antimicrobial properties, but against the harsh winter, such remedies were fragile shields. Still, in a world without doctors for peasants, any action was better than none. Superstition often blurred into medicine. Some families hung pieces of iron near the bed, believing it cut fevers. Others sprinkled holy water on straw, convinced it drove out sickness as well as spirits. Saints were invoked, especially Street Blaze, patron of throat ailments. In many ways, these rituals weren't just about curing the body, they were about soothing the mind. To believe you were doing something gave hope, and hope itself was a form of survival. Illness also shaped the very structure of sleep. Families placed children in the center of the bed, surrounded by adults, so their bodies could absorb warmth and fight off fever. Parents often sacrificed their own comfort, taking the edges of the bed, shivering so that little ones had the best chance of surviving the night. This was not just instinct, it was strategy, practiced over generations. But even with every precaution, death was never far. Archaeologists studying medieval cemeteries often find a staggering number of child burials. Some villages show nearly half of all graves belonging to children under 5. Winter nights were brutal tests, and not everyone made it to dawn. Imagine the fear of a parent waking in the smoky dark, reaching for a child, and realizing the small body beside them had grown cold. That terror was part of medieval sleep, unspoken but ever present. Some historians argue that peasants accepted illness with resignation, seeing it as God's will. Others believe families fought fiercely, clinging to every remedy and ritual. The truth is probably both. Mothers mixed herbs at midnight, fathers prayed aloud, while at the same time everyone knew that sometimes nothing could be done. Survival was a lottery of faith, fortune, and the strength of fragile bodies. Interestingly, monks and nobles weren't spared either. Monastic records complain of frostbitten fingers and winter coughs that swept through cloisters. Even in castles, where beds were layered with furs and tapestries lined walls, sickness lingered. Drafty stone halls were no defense against influenza. The cold was the great equalizer. It seeped into lungs, no matter your rank. One curious piece of folklore suggested that laughter helped ward off illness. Villagers would tell jokes by the fire, believing joy kept death at bay. Was it medical science? Not exactly. But modern studies do show that laughter boosts immunity. Maybe medieval peasants, without knowing why, tapped into a real truth. And so, a story or a song at night wasn't just entertainment, it was medicine. Food also played a huge role. Malnutrition made peasants more vulnerable to sickness. A winter diet of bread, porridge, and turnips left bodies weak. Rare feasts with meat or spiced ale gave a temporary boost, but most nights, hunger gnawed quietly in the background. Dreams themselves often reflected it. Peasants dreamed of bread and warm stews, their subconscious yearning for what their stomachs lacked. So when we ask, where did medieval peasants sleep during freezing winter nights? The answer is layered. They slept in smoky huts, yes. On straw beds, yes. But they also slept with sickness. They slept with coughing children beside them, with fear hanging heavy in the rafters, with remedies and prayers woven into every night. Sleep was not rest. It was survival. A fragile gamble repeated until spring finally arrived. And through all of it, resilience endured. Every morning when a child stirred, when an old man coughed but still breathed, it was a victory. Families counted these victories quietly, night after night. That is the hidden story of medieval sleep, not just the cold, but the courage to face the cold again and again, even when lungs burned and fevers raged. When we picture medieval nights, it's tempting to imagine two worlds so far apart they might as well have belonged to different planets. The smoky peasant hut with its straw floor, and the stone castle chamber with its towering feather bed. But here's the secret history, rarely told: both worlds, rich and poor, still fought the same enemy. The cold did not bow to wealth. Let's start with the peasants, since their story was the majority's. A peasant's bed, if you could even call it that, was a sack stuffed with straw. refreshed when it grew too foul, patched with whatever scraps were available. Sometimes the straw was simply piled in a corner, no sack at all. Blankets? Rare. More often it was cloaks, patched linen, or animal hides layered together. Bedding wasn't bought in sets, it was cobbled from life's leftovers. Now imagine climbing from that into the chambers of a lord or lady. Surviving inventories from noble estates describe beds as prized possessions, handed down through generations. Oak frames carved with intricate patterns, testers and canopies hung with tapestries, curtains that could be drawn to create a cocoon against drafts. On those beds lay mattresses filled with feathers, down or wool, sometimes stacked 2 or 3 high. Linen sheets imported from abroad, velvet or fur coverlets, even embroidered nightcaps. By all appearances, it sounds like heaven compared to a peasant's straw sack. And yet, even in the grandest castles, winter made itself known. Stone walls radiated cold like the inside of a cave. Windows, when they existed, let in drafts despite their shutters. Fires roared in great halls but dwindled to embers in private chambers. One noblewoman in 14th century France complained in a letter that she woke to find frost on the inside of her bed curtains. Imagine that, wrapped in velvet and fur, surrounded by servants, and still shivering under ice. So what's the truth? Comfort was relative. A feather bed was softer, certainly, but it could hide as many fleas as a peasant's straw. Rich linens were warm, but washing them was still rare in winter. And while a peasant had goats and pigs pressed against him for warmth, nobles sometimes slept with small dogs at their feet, comfort hounds, whose job was not guarding but keeping toes from freezing. Different animals, same instinct. The social symbolism of beds, however, was enormous. For peasants, a bed wasn't even worth mentioning in wills, it was too temporary. For nobles, beds were wealth, sometimes valued as much as jewelry. To own an ornate bed was to display power. Sleep itself became a performance of status. In fact, noble families often entertained guests in bedchambers, with curtains drawn back to display their finery. But here's where things blur. No matter the wealth, nobody in the Middle Ages slept truly alone. In peasant huts, it was necessity, crowded families huddled together. In castles, it was hierarchy. Lords slept with attendants in the room, servants tending fires, guards at the door, sometimes children sharing chambers. Privacy was rare in both worlds. Darkness encouraged closeness, whether for warmth or for duty. There's another symmetry. Both peasants and nobles prayed before bed. Peasants muttered rough Latin verses or folk charms, tracing crosses on children's foreheads. Nobles knelt beside canopied beds, reciting psalms or commissioning priests to bless their chambers. Different words, same purpose, asking protection through the night. The fear of spirits, illness, and sudden death did not discriminate by class. Even remedies overlapped. Nobles had bed-warming pans, metal trays filled with coals slid under sheets. Peasants used heated stones wrapped in rags, or simply the body of a pig. Different tools, same idea. One had brass and polish, the other soot and ash. Both aimed to dull the bite of ice. Historians debate how much more comfortable nobles truly were. Some argue wealth bought real relief. Others say it mostly bought appearances. A tapestry on a castle wall looked glorious, but it was also insulation no different in purpose from a peasant's patched cloth curtain. Both worlds layered scraps against winter, and yet envy must have lingered. Folk tales often mocked the rich for their laziness, painting lords as men who lounged in bed while peasants toiled. Humor softened bitterness, but it also revealed longing. To lie on feathers instead of straw was no small luxury, but it's telling that nobles themselves still complained of cold. Even with 3 mattresses stacked high, they cursed the same drafts that peasants patched with moss. So where did medieval peasants sleep during freezing winter nights? In huts of wood and wattle? Yes. But so too did nobles in halls of stone. The differences were real: straw versus feather, goats versus hounds, rags versus velvet. Yet the rhythm was shared. Both rich and poor went to bed each night, bracing for the cold, layering defenses, whispering prayers, hoping to see the sun. That's the strange truth of medieval sleep. Status shaped the trappings, but not the struggle. Winter humbled everyone. Whether on a straw pallet in a smoky hut or a feather bed behind velvet curtains, the night was always longer, colder, and harder than we imagine today. If you want to understand how medieval peasants survived the long winters, you cannot ignore the role of faith. For them, religion wasn't something set aside for Sundays. It shaped the rhythm of every day and every night, including the way they slept. Picture the small village church, its bell tower standing above fields buried in snow. That bell marked time, not only for work, but also for rest. Monks in nearby monasteries rose at midnight to chant prayers, and even in peasant huts, families echoed that rhythm in their own rough way. When a fire was stirred in the middle of the night, it was often accompanied by whispered verses. When a child coughed, the mother might murmur a prayer to Street Blaze, patron of throats, before laying the child back down. These prayers were not polished Latin liturgy. Most peasants barely knew fragments. What they spoke was often half-remembered, broken words passed from parent to child. And yet, those words mattered. In a hut where drafts slipped through every crack, where fleas tormented the straw, and where hunger gnawed at the stomach, prayer provided something blankets could not structure. It gave shape to fear. There were charms too, iron scissors placed on the windowsill to cut off evil spirits, salt sprinkled at thresholds to block witches, children warned not to point at the moon, lest something follow them inside. Was it superstition? Absolutely. But it was also strategy. Fear, given rules, became easier to live with. You didn't need to conquer the night, you needed only to believe you had tools to endure it. The overlap between faith and folk belief blurred constantly. Priests scolded peasants for muttering charms or reciting the Lord's Prayer backward, but the people swore it worked. One English family was even recorded for sprinkling holy water over their straw bedding before lying down, convinced it would repel sickness. Whether it did or not, the act itself soothed them enough to close their eyes. Monastic life amplified this connection between sleep and faith. In Benedictine and Cistercian monasteries, monks slept in long dormitories on narrow pallets, fully clothed, belts fastened, boots sometimes still on. Comfort was denied deliberately. Softness was considered a temptation. At midnight the bells rang, and every monk rose, shuffling in silence to chant psalms in the dark chapel. Cold was part of their discipline, endurance part of their devotion. For peasants, the austerity of monastic sleep was alien, even unimaginable. But the rhythm of night vigils, the idea that someone, somewhere, was awake and praying while others slept, gave comfort. Villagers often said the monks' voices kept the devil away from the field. It was as if the monks stood guard not only over their cloisters, but over the countryside itself. Inside cottages, families created their own nightly rituals. A mother crossing herself before pulling a blanket higher, a father tracing a cross on a child's forehead, an old man muttering psalm fragments he barely understood. These weren't just habits, they were defenses. Without modern medicine, peasants leaned on faith to guard against fever, bad dreams, and the unseen forces of the dark. Festivals deepened this connection. On Christmas Eve, villagers packed into churches lit with candles, their smoky huts left behind for a night of sacred brightness. Singing carols together, hearing bells peal through the frozen air, these were moments when winter's grip loosened, if only for a few hours. Back in their huts, the warmth lingered, not in temperature but in spirit. Children fell asleep, humming the same carols. Parents whispered blessings over their straw. And let's not forget dreams. Medieval people often treated dreams as messages from God, saints, or devils. A nightmare might be blamed on demons, pressing on the chest the mare that gave us the word nightmare. A sweet dream of green fields in winter might be seen as a promise that spring would come. Priests sometimes warned peasants not to take dreams too seriously, but in the smoky dark of a hut, when hunger twisted the stomach, dreams felt like omens worth repeating by the morning fire. So where did medieval peasants sleep during freezing winter nights? Yes, in huts of straw and smoke. But they also slept under the weight of faith. Every draft that rattled the shutters was answered with a whispered prayer. Every unexplained creak was explained by a spirit or saint. Faith was not decoration, it was survival. Modern historians argue about whether this reliance on religion made life easier or harder. Some say it gave peasants peace of mind, a psychological defense against fear. Others argue it deepened anxiety, filling every shadow with demons. The truth, as always, is somewhere in between. Belief carried both comfort and burden, but it carried them. Think of it this way. Medieval peasants fought the cold with scraps of wool, goats, and smoky fires, but they fought the unknown with prayers, charms, and stories. Both kinds of defense were necessary. Without one, their bodies froze. Without the other, their spirits broke. And that may be the greatest lesson of all. To survive winter nights in the Middle Ages, peasants didn't just pile on blankets, they piled on meaning. Every prayer, every superstition, every whispered word was another layer against the dark. And though we might dismiss these beliefs today, they worked in the only way that mattered. They helped people fall asleep in a world where nothing was guaranteed. If faith gave peasants structure for the night, then music and storytelling gave them warmth. Not the kind of warmth you measure in degrees, but the kind that settles into your chest and makes the cold a little easier to bear. Imagine this. Outside the hut, the snow piles high. Wolves prowl the edges of fields, and the wind shrieks through bare branches. Inside, a fire smolders low. Blankets are thin, and the straw beneath you scratches. Yet in the midst of that hardship, a voice begins to sing. It might be a mother humming a lullaby to calm a restless child. It might be an old man croaking out a folk song he learned from his grandfather. Or it might be the whole family joining together. Voices layered over one another, rough but steady. Music in these huts was not about performance. It was survival. A song filled the silence that otherwise felt endless. A lullaby soothed not only the children, but the adults who needed to believe that peace was possible. Lullabies themselves reveal this dual role. Many medieval songs for children mixed tenderness with warning. They told little ones to hush or the cold would take them, to be still or spirits would creep near. At first this seems harsh, but it reflects reality. Fear was folded into comfort because that was the truth of life. Parents used song to teach resilience even as they rocked their children to sleep. And when children slept, stories filled the void. Folklorists argue that some of our best-known fairy tale stories of clever foxes, trickster wolves, magical helpers were born in smoky huts just like these. Imagine peasants lying side by side, too cold to move, too tired to work, whispering tales into the dark. A fox that outsmarts a farmer, a poor girl who finds treasure in the forest. These weren't just diversions, they were lessons, little mirrors of life's struggles and hopes. One curious detail preserved in French sources tells us riddles were a favorite nighttime pastime. What runs but never moves? What has a mouth but cannot speak? Such questions circled the hut, children guessing, adults laughing softly when someone blurted a silly answer. These games were not trivial. They were training for sharpness of mind in a world that demanded cunning. And they filled hours when silence might have grown too heavy. Music could be equally playful. Work songs carried into the night, reframed as jokes or parodies. Some surviving medieval carols describe peasants singing in alehouses, teasing neighbors, or mocking nobles. Even in hardship, laughter slipped in. One 15th century account tells of a lord scandalized to find villagers laughing and singing late into the night despite their poverty. He called it idleness. They called it survival. Think of it. Fleas still bit. Drafts still slipped through the shutters. Coughs still echoed in the dark. But if you could laugh at a fox tricking a farmer or hum a tune about summer meadows, you stole a moment from winter's grip. And sometimes that moment was enough. Travelers shared stories too. A stranger arriving at the hearth often brought not only frost on his cloak, but tales from another village. Maybe he'd speak of a market in the next town, or a wedding, or even rumors of war. In a world without newspapers, stories traded at night were news, entertainment, and cultural glue. Suspicion might linger, but curiosity usually won. To hear a voice from beyond your frozen fields was to remember the wider world. Scholars debate how central these nightly traditions were. Some argue exhaustion left little room for song or story. Others insist they were vital, pointing to how many folk tales and ballads survived into later centuries. The truth is probably both. Not every night was filled with laughter. Some were too cold, too hungry, too heavy. But enough nights carried music and story that generations remembered them. And here lies the hidden strength. These stories and songs left no trace in archaeology. You cannot dig up a laugh or carbon date a lullaby. Yet without them, no one would have endured. They were invisible armor, a cultural insulation layered over wool and straw. Consider, too, the communal effect. When one person sang, others listened, joined, or smiled. When one told a story, others leaned closer, eyes catching firelight. These moments created unity stronger than any patched blanket. You didn't just survive the cold alone, you survived as a group. The very act of listening was warmth. One detail from German chronicles describes villagers singing together after feast days, carrying those melodies home into their huts. Even days later, families would hum the same refrains at night, like embers of celebration still glowing. Music linked hut to hut, making the whole village a single chorus against winter. What's striking is how these traditions cut across class. Nobles, too, filled their long nights with songs, tales, and riddles, though theirs were polished, written down, ornamented. Peasants had no parchment. Their art was in memory, in repetition, in the rough cadence of voices carried through smoke. Different worlds, yet the same impulse, to make the night livable. And so, when you ask where medieval peasants slept during freezing winter nights, the answer goes beyond straw beds and smoky rafters. They slept inside stories. They curled up inside lullabies. They wrapped themselves in laughter and riddles. Cold seeped through walls, fleas bit, hunger gnawed. But as long as voices rose, singing, joking, telling tales, the night was never completely won by winter. That is the detail historians sometimes miss when they count deaths or record famines. Survival wasn't only physical, it was emotional. The peasant's true blanket was community, and every story, every song, every laugh in the smoky dark was another stitch in that quilt. If peasants filled their smoky huts with laughter and lullabies, monasteries filled theirs with silence and discipline. And that contrast tells us a lot about the medieval world. Because where you slept wasn't just a question of comfort, it was a reflection of your role in society, your faith, and even your sense of what life meant. Picture the village hut, once more crowded bodies pressed together, goats snorting at the foot of the bed, children coughing into patched blankets, prayers murmured in half-remembered Latin. Now shift the scene to a monastery. Long stone dormitories, rows of narrow pallets set evenly apart, each monk fully clothed in coarse wool. Blankets were thin, fires scarce, and silence enforced. The logic was deliberate. Comfort bred weakness. Hardship, they believed, bred holiness. The rule of Saint Benedict, written centuries earlier but followed across Europe, demanded that monks be ready at any moment to rise for prayer. That meant no undressing for sleep, no sprawling in comfort. In some orders, monks even slept sitting upright to avoid drifting too deeply into sloth. Think of that. While peasants wrapped themselves tighter around children, monks denied themselves even the simple luxury of lying down freely. Their cold was chosen, a spiritual discipline. But did it make them stronger or simply sicker? Records suggest both. Chroniclers complain of frozen ink in scriptoria, of monks coughing through psalms with frost on their breath. Some developed lung ailments or chilblains from constant cold. Yet others praised the discipline, claiming it purified the soul. Scholars today remain divided. Was it resilience or needless suffering? In truth, it was probably both. What's striking is that, despite these differences, both peasants and monks faced the same enemy, the winter night. One fought it with goats and patched blankets, the other with prayer and denial. Both strategies only partly worked. Both left bodies shivering, but each reflected a deeper worldview. For peasants, survival was about community and endurance. For monks, it was about devotion and sacrifice. Now, shift again to the castle. Nobles lay on carved oak bedsteads, feather mattresses stacked high, furs layered heavy. On paper, it looks like paradise compared to straw and smoke. And yet, stone is colder than mud. Castle walls breathe frost, drafts slid through arrow slits, and even noblewomen complained of waking to find ice forming on the inside of bed curtains. Wealth helped, but it didn't conquer winter. That's the symmetry most people forget. A peasant cursed his flea bites. A lord cursed his frozen nose. Both struggled, both endured. But the symbolism of the bed mattered. For nobles, a bed was not only for sleep, it was a display of power. In wills, bedsteads were prized heirlooms, passed down generations. Tapestries and embroidered curtains weren't just insulation, they were status. Sleep became theater as much as necessity. And yet, servants still stoked fires at midnight. Maids still carried warming pans filled with embers to slide under sheets, risking sparks. Dogs, so-called comfort hounds, were kept in noble chambers, not for barking, but for their body heat. Strip away the finery, and the strategies looked familiar. The poor relied on pigs and goats, the rich on hounds and feather beds. But the principle was the same. No one liked crawling into icy bedding. So where did medieval peasants sleep during freezing winter nights? The answer becomes clearer the more you compare. They slept in huts patched with cloth, huddled together with children and animals. Monks slept in rows, clothed and rigid, denying themselves comfort as proof of faith. Nobles slept in grandeur, but still woke to drafts and frost. The details differed, but the struggle was universal. This is what makes the medieval night so fascinating. It was not just a backdrop, it was an active force, shaping culture, faith, and identity. Peasants invented folk tales to fill the dark. Monks turned it into discipline. Nobles tried to drape it in luxury. But none escaped it. Winter humbled everyone. Think of the symbolism in that. The same rooster crowed over hut and castle. The same frost crept across straw and velvet. The same wind howled at shutter and tapestry alike. Beds reflected class, but cold united all. That's why winter nights are such a powerful window into medieval life. They reveal the common struggle that ran through every rank. One anecdote from a satirical poem captures this perfectly. A nobleman is mocked for piling mattress upon mattress, like a frog on a stack of lily pads, yet still complaining that his nose froze at night. It's funny, yes, but it's also telling. Even privilege couldn't buy freedom from the season. Comfort was always relative. And maybe that's the deepest truth. Peasants didn't dream of silk sheets. They dreamed of surviving until dawn. Nobles didn't always appreciate their feather beds. They cursed their drafts the way peasants cursed fleas. In different ways, all of them learned the same lesson. You don't conquer the medieval night. You endure it. So when you picture where peasants slept, don't stop at the straw and the smoky hut. Picture also the monastery, the castle, the larger world that framed their nights. Because only in contrast does their endurance shine. They lacked furs and feather mattresses, yes, but they also lacked the illusions of comfort. Their strategies, huddling, patching, laughing, praying, were raw, but they worked. And perhaps that honesty was its own kind of strength. If the smoky hut and the cold stone monastery showed us the practical side of survival, then folklore shows us the emotional side. Because no matter how many blankets you stitched together or how many goats you pulled close, the medieval night was never just about cold air. It was about what the darkness might hold. For peasants, the night was alive. Every creak in the rafters, every whistle through the cracks, could mean more than just wind. People believed the darkness itself had rules. Break them, and you invited spirits inside. Follow them, and maybe, just maybe, you could sleep safely until dawn. One common belief, recorded in English sermons and German folk tales alike, was that nightmares weren't just dreams. They were attacks. The Alp in German lore was a creature that pressed on your chest, stealing your breath. In England, they called it the mare, and from that word we still say nightmare. Think about it. A peasant wakes in the night, pinned under the weight of a pig or the crush of a cousin's elbow, heart racing, breath short. How else to explain it but a demon sitting on their chest? So they fought back with charms. Some households placed iron scissors on the windowsill. The open blades pointed outward to cut spirits before they entered. Others sprinkled salt across thresholds, believing witches couldn't cross it. In France, parents scolded children for pointing at the moon after dark folklore said it invited spirits to follow your finger straight inside. Were these tricks effective? From our modern perspective, no. But from theirs, effectiveness wasn't the point. Fear had to be managed, given a shape, and answered with ritual. A prayer, a gesture, a charm. They were psychological blankets, just as real in comfort as wool and straw. Prayer itself blurred into folk magic. Families prayed before bed, yes, but sometimes in strange ways. One English chronicle describes a family reciting the Lord's Prayer backwards, convinced it trapped demons at the threshold. Priests condemned it as superstition, but the family swore by its power. Was it wrong? Or was it simply their version of faith? And then there were remedies against more earthly intruders. Fleas, lice, bedbugs. No one was spared. Even monasteries complained of lice in their dormitories. So peasants burned herbs like wormwood or pennyroyal, letting the smoke drift through bedding. Did it work? Historians argue. Some say it was just psychological. Others point out that strong plant oils do repel insects. A German household guide even suggested scattering ashes into the straw, so fleas would dislike the texture. Imagine lying down in soot-dusted bedding just to quiet the itching. It sounds miserable, but desperation makes sense of strange remedies. Another folk cure involved smoking bedding over the hearth, hanging straw sacks above the fire to kill vermin. The result? Smoky, acrid-smelling blankets, but maybe fewer bites. And sometimes, the remedies were almost beautiful. Sprinkling lavender or fennel seeds in the straw wasn't just supposed to deter pests, it also scented the bed. For a moment, the smoky hut smelled sweet, even if only until the next cough or scratch. But folklore wasn't just about pests and demons. It was about survival as community. In parts of Germany, families were told to welcome guests on winter nights lest Christ arrive in disguise. Hospitality was not optional. Refuse, and you risked not just shame, but damnation. So peasants opened their doors, even to strangers, because trust itself was a kind of survival tool. The paradox was clear. Strangers could be thieves, but strangers could also be salvation. And so families slept with strangers on their floor, cloaks still on, breath mixing with the humid air of the hut. Warmth outweighed suspicion. Cold killed faster than hatred. Even the placement of children became ritualized. The youngest were tucked into the middle, parents and grandparents forming human walls around them. Was it instinct or strategy? Historians still argue. But mothers' arms and fathers' bodies became shields against frost, the arrangement as sacred as any charm. And then came the sounds of the night. Dogs barking in the lane, roosters crowing too early, drunks stumbling home. Folk tales told villagers that barking dogs were clocks of a kind. If the dogs howled, it meant strangers or wolves nearby. If the rooster crowed before dawn, some said it was a warning of spirits wandering. Even noise became part of survival lore. Inside, whispers filled the dark. Parents taught children rhymes, little prayers that doubled as lullabies. Some sprinkled holy water on straw, convinced it kept sickness away. Others hung a child's christening cloth as a canopy over the bed, a charm against both cold and evil. Bedtime was never just physical. It was spiritual, cultural, emotional. Scholars remain divided on whether these beliefs offered real comfort or fueled more anxiety. Some argue that charms and prayers allowed peasants to rest, convincing them the night was under control. Others insist that the constant fear of spirits, demons, and sickness made sleep shallow and broken. The truth, as always, lies somewhere between. Belief was both burden and balm. But maybe that's what survival really looked like. It wasn't just about goats pressed close or blankets patched again and again. It was about stories, prayers, charms, and rituals that turned chaos into something people could endure. Because in the medieval night, comfort was impossible. But endurance was always within reach. If the herbs and charms gave peasants something to believe in, then stories and songs gave them something to feel. Because in a world where blankets were thin, walls were porous, and fleas never really left you alone, the human voice was often the most powerful comfort of all. Picture a smoky hut after the embers have been stirred, the coughs and scratches fading for a while. What fills the silence? Words. Stories passed from one mouth to another, weaving themselves into the straw and smoke. Folklorists believe many of the fairy tales we know today, foxes tricking farmers, saints defeating devils, clever peasants outwitting lords, were first whispered in huts like these, while children drifted to sleep with their heads in their mothers' laps. Stories weren't just entertainment. They were instruction manuals for survival. A tale about a greedy neighbor taught children the dangers of envy. A story about a saint's miracle gave hope when food ran low. A fox stealing chickens became a warning to guard the coop better. Every word carried a lesson, disguised as laughter or wonder. And then there were riddles. Simple questions traded back and forth while wind moaned outside. What runs but never moves? What has a mouth but never speaks? Archaeologists can't dig up riddles, but chronicles and folk records hint at how common they were. Imagine a family huddled in straw, taking turns to guess answers, distracting themselves from hunger with puzzles as old as time. For a moment, fleas didn't matter. Cold didn't matter. Only the game mattered. Music carried the same power. No instruments were required. A mother's hum, cracked and tired, could soothe more than any blanket. A lullaby was more than a tune. It was a promise. Sleep, child. I am here. Across Europe, folk songs crept into huts at night, carrying rhythms of planting, harvesting, saints' feast days. Music gave shape to the dark, replacing fear with cadence. One curious note from a 15th century chronicle describes a nobleman visiting a village and being shocked to hear peasants laughing and singing late at night despite their poverty. He scolded them for idleness. Their reply? "If we cannot laugh, we will die faster." That reply is both tragic and brilliant. Laughter itself was a weapon against despair. Think about it. The fire is low. The draft still whistles. The fleas still bite. But someone cracks a joke about the pig hogging the blanket, and suddenly, the hut feels lighter. Humor was insulation, invisible but real. Travelers often joined in, too. Strangers at the hearth would tell their own tales of roads blocked by snow, of lords demanding taxes, of saints' shrines visited far away. Their words wove outsiders into the family fabric, if only for one night. Suspicion softened when voices mingled. A shared story could turn strangers into allies, at least until dawn, and festivals made it even stronger. On nights like Christmas or Epiphany, huts spilled their voices into the lanes. Bonfires lit the village square. Carols rose, and peasants who lived on turnips for months tasted spiced ale and roasted meat. Joy was brief, but powerful. It punctured the gloom like a spear of light. Inside huts afterward, children fell asleep smiling, their bellies fuller than usual, their dreams less haunted by hunger. Scholars debate whether these moments of laughter and music were rare luxuries or nightly rituals. Some argue peasants were too exhausted for stories most nights. Others point to the persistence of folktales and songs as proof that people made time for them. The truth likely lies in between. Not every night carried a fox story or a riddle, but often enough to leave echoes that lasted centuries. And when words failed, silence carried its own weight. But it was never empty silence. It was communal. Dozens of breaths rising and falling together. Snores, coughs, shifting bodies. That sound itself was reassurance. You weren't alone in the dark. You belonged to a rhythm larger than yourself. So how did medieval peasants survive freezing nights? Not just with goats, blankets, and prayers. They survived with laughter, stories, and songs. They built warmth out of words. They patched fear with riddles. They wrapped children not only in wool, but in lullabies. Because the greatest truth of all was simple. Cold could crack walls. Fleas could torment skin. Hunger could hollow bellies. But as long as voices filled the night, rough, imperfect, human, the dark was never absolute. When you think about medieval sleep, it's easy to imagine one mass of bodies tangled in straw. But within that heap, there was order. Children, adults, and elders didn't just collapse wherever they pleased. Their positions, their roles, even their discomfort, all reflected the harsh arithmetic of survival. Children always came first, not in comfort, but in priority. Peasant families knew well that the youngest were the most vulnerable to cold and illness. That's why bedtime often began with them. Contemporary household notes and folk sayings suggest that the littlest were tucked in long before the parents lay down. Their small bodies were cocooned in whatever scraps of cloth or patched blankets the family could spare. A mother might warm a child's feet in her lap before laying him down, or wrap him in her own cloak while chores were finished. The logic was brutal but simple. If the children didn't make it through the night, the family's future didn't either. That's why the warmest spot wasn't a privilege for elders or parents. It was the center of the bed. Infants and toddlers were pressed there, between mother and father, surrounded by older siblings like a living wall. In an age when frost could creep indoors and turn water to ice beside the bed, the safest insulation was human. It's telling that folk tales warned of the dangers of children rolling to the edge of the bed not because of falls, but because the edge meant cold, and cold meant danger. Older children had a different role. They were part warmth givers, part little guardians. Adolescents were often kept closer to the edges, ready to rise if animals stirred or the fire needed tending. They might fetch water, stir embers, or help calm younger siblings in the night. Childhood ended quickly in this world, and even sleep carried responsibility. A teenager's body might ache from farm labor all day, but at night they were still expected to be useful, not just warm. And then there were the parents. Their role was paradoxical, protectors and sufferers at once. Mothers often gave up their share of warmth for children, pulling blankets tighter around little ones and leaving their own shoulders bare. Fathers might take the draft side of the bed, shielding the family from the cold wall. Parish records even mention fines against mothers accused of neglect if infants froze during the night, showing just how much responsibility weighed on parents. Every night was a test of care measured in breath, heat, and survival. The elderly, though, often drew the hardest lot. They were usually placed at the edges of the sleeping pile, where cold drafts crept through cracks in the walls. Partly, this was practicality, their bodies less able to rise quickly, their labor less immediate for the household. And partly, it was grim reality. When choices had to be made, warmth was reserved for those who carried the family forward. Yet elders weren't without value. Their prayers, stories, and wisdom were as much a shield as a blanket. Children drifted to sleep listening to grandparents tell folk tales. The mutter of an old man reciting a psalm in the dark was as steadying as the crackle of embers. Still, the physical toll was undeniable. Historical studies of medieval cemeteries show spikes in winter mortality, especially among the very old. Coughs turned into chest fevers, aching joints stiffened in the cold, and once illness spread in the cramped air of a hut, the elderly were the first to decline. But even in the edge of the bed, they were not entirely abandoned. Families pressed close when they could. A grandchild's body curled against an old woman's back might mean one more morning survived. Archaeologists sometimes point to patterns in soot stains and straw bedding that suggest these arrangements weren't random. Circles formed around hearths, lines pressed against walls, clusters with children tucked inside. It wasn't luxury. It was geometry of survival, played out night after night. One peculiar anecdote from a Dutch folktale describes children being told that angels only watched over them if they lay still at night. It was a clever trick to keep little ones from wriggling out of the warm center into dangerous drafts. Another tale from France warned that whoever slept at the edge would wake with the wolf's breath on their cheek, a poetic way of reminding families that the wall side was colder and riskier. Adults bore the constant negotiation. Who slept nearest the fire? Who gave up their cloak? Who took the side closest to the door, where intruders or wind might enter? Every choice reflected love, obligation, or simple necessity. Survival wasn't just about having enough warmth, it was about distributing it wisely. And then there was the emotional weight. Imagine being a parent lying awake, listening to your child's thin breathing in the smoky dark, counting each rise and fall, praying the cough didn't deepen into something worse. Imagine being an elder pressed against the wall, teeth chattering, whispering a story to distract yourself from the draft. Imagine being a teenager, pretending to sleep, but knowing you'll be nudged awake when the fire dies down. Sleep wasn't just physical, it was emotional labor too. Modern historians debate how peasants themselves saw this arrangement. Did they resent the lack of space? Did they find comfort in the closeness? Some argue that constant contact blurred boundaries and made privacy impossible. Others emphasized the deep bonds it created, a nightly reminder that survival was communal. Likely, both feelings coexisted: frustration at elbows in your ribs, but also gratitude for the heat of another body keeping frost at bay. So when we ask, where did medieval peasants sleep during freezing nights? The answer isn't just on straw with blankets. The deeper truth is that they slept within a hierarchy of care. Children tucked in first, parents sacrificing comfort, elders lingering at the edges but anchoring the night with wisdom. Sleep was a map of survival, traced across the straw by age, duty, and love. And maybe that's why so many medieval prayers at bedtime didn't ask for wealth or luxury. They asked simply for safe rest, for another dawn. Because in a smoky hut pressed with bodies, with fleas biting and drafts creeping, every breath through the night was both a risk and a victory. If cold and hunger were constant enemies of medieval sleep, sickness was the silent intruder. In a smoky, overcrowded hut, it slipped between bodies as easily as the draft through the walls. One child coughed, and by dawn, half the bed was wheezing. A grandfather sneezed, and days later the entire household felt it. In winter especially, illness was inevitable. Parish records across Europe show grim spikes in deaths during January and February. The terms they used were vague: fevers of the chest, winter agues, a wasting sickness. But reading between the lines, historians recognize pneumonia, influenza, and bronchitis. These were killers, and they spread in the very closeness that peasants depended on for warmth. What saved families from frost also exposed them to contagion. Inside the hut, there was no concept of quarantine. When a child grew feverish, he still slept pressed against his siblings. A mother with a hacking cough still curled around her baby. Separation wasn't possible when survival meant sharing heat. So sickness spread quickly, as relentless as the cold itself. What could peasants do? Without modern medicine, they leaned on remedies that were equal parts practical, hopeful, and symbolic. Herbal knowledge, passed down from grandmothers and village healers, offered some relief. Warm onion poultices were pressed to chests to draw out sickness. Honey, mixed with vinegar, soothed throats. Garlic, believed to ward off evil, was also chewed to fight infection. Did these work? Sometimes, in small ways. Honey truly did coat sore throats. Garlic had mild antibacterial properties, but most of it was comfort more than cure. Folk superstition added another layer. Some believed iron placed above a bed could cut fever, or that hanging a charm of herbs above the door would keep illness out. Parish priests encouraged prayers to street blaze, protector against throat ailments, or street rotch, guardian against plagues. Mothers whispered psalms over sleeping children, crossing their foreheads as embers glowed low. Faith was medicine too, at least for the spirit. And then there was smoke. Bedding was sometimes hung above the hearth, deliberately smoked to kill lice and fleas, which spread disease. The result was blankets that smelled scorched, but perhaps slightly less alive with vermin. Ashes were scattered into straw to deter pests. Wormwood, tansy, and pennyroyal were burned for their pungent fumes, believed to drive away insects and sickness alike. The hut reeked of bitterness, but families endured it if it meant a night of fewer bites. Even so, sickness lingered. Archaeologists studying medieval cemeteries have found high numbers of child graves, many under 5 years old. In some villages, half of all children never reached adulthood. For peasants, winter nights weren't just about comfort, they were about whether the weakest would see the morning. Every wheeze in the straw, every rattle of breath, was a reminder of how fragile life was. But peasants didn't simply surrender. They layered defenses as carefully as they layered cloth against the cold. A steaming pot of ale brewed with herbs might be passed around before bed, warming throats and dulling pain. A mother might rub goose fat on a child's chest, believing it drew sickness out. A father might place a hot brick wrapped in cloth at the foot of the bed to ease aching limbs. Small comforts, but meaningful. And they fought with community too. Neighbors sometimes shared herbs or broth, offering what little they had. In a world where survival was collective, illness was too. If one hut fell silent, the others noticed. Bells tolled not just for nobles, but for peasants too, marking each loss to the winter night. Still, humor crept in even here. Folklore sometimes described fleas and lice as God's little reminders of humility. Villagers joked that no man could be proud while scratching at his tunic. Perhaps laughter softened the fear. Perhaps jokes about vermin made the itching less unbearable, the coughs less frightening. Scholars debate how much these remedies really helped. Some argue peasants lived in a constant fog of low-grade illness, never fully well but not always fatally sick either. Others believe winter epidemics were devastating, cutting through families year after year. The truth is likely both. Endurance mixed with tragedy, resilience mixed with loss. What we can say for certain is that peasants faced each night knowing the risks. Cold, hunger, fleas, and now sickness, all pressing in. And yet, they didn't stop lying down together. They didn't abandon the closeness that carried them through. Because in the balance between freezing apart and coughing together, they chose warmth. It was never about comfort, it was always about survival. And maybe that's the lesson worth remembering. Medieval peasants did not sleep soundly, but they slept stubbornly. They patched blankets, burned herbs, muttered prayers, and endured the wheeze of their children beside them. Because to give up was to die, and to persist was to live another day. Night in a medieval village was never silent, and it was never entirely safe. Beyond the prayers and charms, peasants faced very real threats that tested their courage every evening. Thin wooden doors, barred with nothing more than a plank, stood between families and the outside world. For people who owned so little, even a stolen chicken or pig could mean disaster. And so, as the family settled into the straw, there was always one ear tuned to the noises outside. Court records across Europe reveal countless fines for theft animals disappearing in the night, tools taken from barns, food stolen from kitchens. These weren't glamorous raids led by knights or bandits in shining helmets. They were desperate acts, often by neighbors or wanderers, driven by the same hunger everyone felt. Winter sharpened temptation. Hunger turned good men into thieves, and thieves into shadows scratching at cottage doors. Imagine lying on the straw when a sudden knock rattled the wood. Was it a neighbor, a beggar, or someone waiting to force their way in? The fear was real enough that some villages invented makeshift security. In Flanders, one chronicle mentions families setting noisy boards by their doors so intruders would trip and wake the household. Others dug shallow pits or left tools near the threshold to serve as alarms. Primitive, yes, but when survival hinged on a piglet, or sack of barley, every precaution mattered. Superstition often blurred with practicality. One curious belief claimed that placing a broom across the door would confuse thieves or spirits, forcing them to count every straw before entering. Did it work? Not likely. But it reveals how people layered faith onto fear, hoping words and objects could stall danger long enough for someone to wake. The father in our imagined cottage often stayed half awake, staff across his knees, ready to strike if the latch lifted. Vigilance was exhausting, but necessary. His silhouette by the fire was both guard and comfort, reassuring the children that someone stood between them and the unknown. How heavy must that responsibility have felt, night after night? Historians debate whether peasants truly slept poorly because of such fears, or whether they simply adapted, accepting the risk as part of life. Some argue that constant anxiety wore people down, leaving them perpetually restless. Others suggest that familiarity dulled fear, that peasants grew used to knocks and creaks the way we grow used to city sirens or distant traffic. Perhaps both are true. Fear was sharpest when the dog barked or the door rattled, but dulled into background noise most nights. Still, the fragility of sleep is undeniable. One thin plank was all that stood between safety and loss. Compared to castles with their stone walls and barred gates, the peasant hut was porous, vulnerable from every angle. And yet, castles were not invincible either. Records show nobles complaining of raids, robberies, even murders inside fortified halls. Wealth drew its own dangers, while poverty's defense was that it offered little to steal. The fear of theft also shaped how families thought about generosity. Hospitality was valued. Travelers were often welcomed into huts during snowstorms, not out of kindness alone, but out of shared survival. Yet trust was fragile. A guest could be savior or thief, blessing or curse. One English chronicle tells of a beggar given shelter who was later accused of stealing a spoon. Whether guilty or not, the story reveals how thin the line was between compassion and suspicion. Inside the hut, these tensions hovered, even as sleep pressed down. Children might drift off easily, their innocence shielding them from worry, but adults carried the weight. Every shuffle outside, every gust against the wall, every distant bark could send a pulse of dread through the straw bed. Modern scholars sometimes downplay these fears, noting that most nights passed quietly. Yet the very presence of charms, prayers, and household customs shows how deeply people felt the need to guard against danger. The medieval night was never neutral. It was an adversary to be survived. And so, when we ask where peasants slept, the answer is not just on straw beside animals. It is under the shadow of constant vigilance. The bed was never only a place of rest. It was a fragile fortress, defended with planks, prayers, and the presence of a watchful parent by the fire. What strikes us today is not just the hardship, but the resilience. In a smoky hut, with fleas biting and cold pressing through walls, peasants still found ways to endure. They laughed, they told stories, they prayed, they sang. Even fear became part of the rhythm of life. To live in a world where knocks in the night might mean hunger at your door, and still rise each morning to tend fields, was its own kind of courage. Perhaps that is the truest picture of medieval sleep. Fragile, restless, never fully safe, but never abandoned. A community of bodies huddled together, guarded by one vigilant figure, strengthened by faith, softened by stories, waiting for dawn. When we look across the social ladder of the Middle Ages, one thing becomes clear. No one truly escaped the grip of winter nights. The way peasants, monks, and nobles slept reveals differences in wealth and culture. Yet it also shows surprising similarities. Let's walk through those layers. Peasants slept on straw, often mixed with husks or moss, spread directly across the earthen floor. It was scratchy, damp, alive with fleas, yet endlessly patched and reused. Wool tunics doubled as nightwear, cloaks became blankets, and animals served as heaters. Privacy did not exist. Families shared every cough, every snore, every restless turn. Sleep was survival, not comfort. Now imagine the monastery. Rows of monks lined up in a cold stone dormitory, each with a narrow pallet and thin woolen cover. Some rules demanded they sleep fully clothed, belts on, ready to rise for midnight prayers at the sound of a bell. Fires were scarce. Comfort was seen as temptation. Sleep here was not about endurance alone, but about discipline. The body's discomfort was thought to sharpen the soul. In some orders, monks even slept sitting upright in chairs, so sloth could never take hold. Was it resilience or cruelty disguised as devotion? Scholars still debate, but what is certain is that even holiness did not make the night warmer. And then, the nobility. In castles, carved oak bedsteads stood proudly, draped with heavy curtains embroidered in gold. Mattresses stuffed with feathers or down promised softness unimaginable to a peasant. Silk nightshirts, fur-lined blankets, even bed-warming pans filled with glowing embers. All of these luxuries gave the impression of paradise. Yet beneath the grandeur, stone walls radiated cold like a dungeon. Drafts slipped through arrow slits, frost formed on tapestries, and nobles still complained of freezing noses and stiff limbs. Luxury softened the edges, but it could not conquer the season. Here lies the symmetry. Whether you lay in straw, on a pallet, or beneath velvet canopies, the cold reached you. Everyone feared drafts. Everyone stirred awake when embers died. Everyone coughed in the smoky dark of winter. Sleep was not divided cleanly by class. It was a universal negotiation with discomfort. But there were differences worth noting. For peasants, survival hinged on community. They pressed together, shared breath, and told stories to pass the night. For monks, survival was bound to ritual. They armed themselves with prayer, believing spiritual warmth outweighed physical chill. For nobles, survival leaned on wealth, purchasing furs, sheets, and servants to tend fires through the night. 3 strategies, 1 struggle. Take the question of privacy. Peasants had none. Entire households, sometimes with travelers, slept shoulder to shoulder in smoky huts. Monks had a form of order, but still lived communally, their dormitories echoing with snores and whispered prayers. Nobles alone could claim curtains drawn around beds, separating themselves from attendants. Yet even here, servants often slept nearby, because no chamber was truly solitary. Medieval life simply did not allow for the isolation we now take for granted. Disease, too, ignored rank. Fleas and lice thrived in straw, but they also hid in furs and feathers. Bed bugs infested noble chambers as much as cottages. Smoke irritated lungs in both huts and halls. When winter fevers spread, children of peasants and heirs of nobles alike could fall ill. The difference was that the wealthy had a better chance of survival, thanks to cleaner linens, larger fires, and access to remedies. Still, the cold reminded everyone that human flesh was fragile. Religion seeped into every layer as well. Peasants whispered prayers and traced crosses over their children before sleep. Monks chanted psalms at midnight, their voices rising in stone halls. Nobles hired priests to bless chambers, sprinkling holy water on bedsheets. Faith was the invisible blanket that every class clung to when the wind howled. One striking observation comes from folklore. Peasant tales often mocked nobles for their endless bedding stories of lords piling mattresses high and still complaining. Nobles, meanwhile, wrote satire about peasants huddling with pigs. Humor, in both cases, was a weapon against discomfort. It shows us that even in their differences, people saw the absurdity of sleep in a world where comfort was never complete. So, where did medieval peasants sleep on freezing nights? They slept on straw, pressed close to family and animals, wrapped in patched wool, beneath roofs that sighed with smoke and dripped with frost. But the larger truth is this: everyone in the Middle Ages, from field laborer to monk to noble, slept in the shadow of the same cold. The forms of bedding and the rituals around them changed, but the struggle was universal. Perhaps that's why dawn was so deeply cherished. To wake after another winter night meant victory, whether you rose from straw, a pallet, or a feather bed. And that victory was shared across all classes. The rooster crowed in peasant lanes and castle courtyards alike. The ember glow of morning fires was as precious in a smoky hut as in a noble chamber. Sleep did not separate society. It bound it together in endurance. Hey guys, as we come to the end of this journey through smoky huts, stone monasteries, and drafty castles, one lesson echoes louder than the wind outside those medieval walls. No matter where you slept, on straw beside a pig, on a pallet under monastic rules, or on feathers draped in velvet winter nights, were never truly conquered. They were endured. Think about it. Families survived not because they discovered perfect warmth, but because they layered scraps of defense. A patched blanket here, a goat curled at the feet there, a whispered prayer, a story told in the dark. Each small act became a stitch in the quilt of survival. And isn't that the way life often works, even now? We don't always find comfort in grand gestures. Sometimes we find it in the little things: the laugh of someone close, the rhythm of a familiar song, the comfort of knowing we're not alone. When dawn broke over those frozen fields, peasants rose stiff and coughing. Monks rose to chant. Nobles rose to complain of drafts. But all of them rose. That was the victory. They bent under hardship, but they did not break. Tonight, as you settle into your own bed, maybe with central heating humming or a soft blanket tucked beneath your chin, take a moment to feel the thread that connects you to them. Across centuries, humans have always found ways to outlast the night. We still layer our defenses: family, faith, humor, and hope. And like them, we rise again when morning comes. So close your eyes, knowing you carry that same resilience. The cold can knock at the window, fear can stir at the edges, but warmth is built in layers of love, of memory, of spirit, and that is something no winter can steal. Good night, my friends. Sleep well, dream easy, and remember, you are part of a story of survival that is older than history itself. Sweet dreams.